Please give a warm welcome to Jennifer Kaminsky, Director of Outreach and Communications at the Climate Registry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. How's the day going? Staying awake? First, want to give a big thanks to our strategy exchange session discussion leaders, who I know facilitated thought-provoking dialogue on a host of engaging topics. So thank you to our leaders in those sessions and also all of the participants. I hope you enjoy those conversations as well that partook. I'd also like to thank our bronze sponsors for all of their support. Environmental Defense Fund, Exelon, Fifth Third Bank, Pacific Gas and Electric, and also Train Technologies. We'll dive right in. Our next speaker will provide an overview of state-led climate action, a What's Happening Where tutorial. Please welcome to the stage Julie Cerqueira, Executive Director of U.S. Climate Alliance.
Great. So I'm not sure how, oh, there we go. Perfect. Great, thanks so much for having me up here to get to share the tremendous work that our states are doing. I recognize that I and a panel are standing between you and dinner and drinks, and so I'm cognizant of that. So I'll try to be quick. But essentially, I guess I should start with the story. So I used to work for the State Department as a senior advisor in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change, where we were part of sort of the negotiating team that dealt with Paris. So I was not a negotiator, but was colleagues with them. And I remember on June 1st sitting in the room wondering where the president was going to land on whether or not we would withdraw from Paris, and our own team didn't know. I mention that because the Rose Garden speech on June 1st, 2017 was when the alliance was launched. So 3 governors from California, New York, and Washington responded to the administration's intent to withdraw from Paris by mobilizing a coalition of governors called the U.S. Climate Alliance that would agree to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement by committing to meet their share of what used to be the U.S. nationally determined contribution. And so when we look today, we are now a bipartisan coalition of 25 governors, which is pretty amazing. And as you see from the stats here as it's grown, this group of governors is now responsible for more than half of the US population. They are 60% of the US economy, and what that means is they are an $11.7 trillion economy. The only national economies that are larger than the Alliance states are the United States itself and China, so it's tremendous. And in addition to that, you see that they're 40% of US emissions. A lot of people will say, well, that's not that much, right? Because it's less than half of US emissions. But when we actually look at what that means globally, they're the 6th largest emitter. And so the actions and the leadership that our states demonstrate actually has not only a national impact, but a global impact. And that's the reason why you see countries all over the world starting to pivot the way that they engage the United States on climate change to focus more on how they can engage subnational actors, both in looking at mutual goals, in how they can cooperate technically in order to advance their own climate agendas. And so we've seen that pivot in part because our governors, mayors have tremendous authorities in the United States, and they have potential to make a real impact in the way that they implement their policies and reduce our emissions profile. I love this photo here because it's, well, it disappeared, but Governor Mills from Maine. She was one of the only representatives on stage from the United States. I think she was actually the only elected US official on stage at the UN Climate Action Summit. And it was an opportunity for her to share the leadership of states on a national platform that usually would have been held actually by the US government. So it just shows the type of leadership and international engagement that we're starting to see actually from our governors. And so the thing that is really powerful, I think, is that you're starting to see US states really rebuild the national climate framework. And so in one sector, for example, on clean energy, In 2015, for example, Hawaii was the only state that had announced it would go 100% clean energy, right? Today, we have 8 states that have that same goal in statute, and another 10 states that are in the process of either submitting legislation or have announced their intention to do so. In addition to that, our states are supporting innovation through investment and through cutting-edge policies. So you'll see here that green banks from Alliance states since 2011 have invested $3.5 billion in clean energy projects. And when we look at policy and innovation, we look at states like Washington that have put forward the first building performance standards at a state level in the country. We look at states like New Jersey, who are the first to actually require project developments to consider their impacts on climate change and to consider sort of their GHG profile and their resilience. States like Virginia, who have put in place the first policies that require new building developments to actually look at projections for sea level rise and to change the way that they're built to make sure that they're accounting for that. So states are not only investing in innovation, but they're putting in place these innovative policies to test models that could be useful for other states or other countries to eventually adopt. In addition to that, states are playing a really important role in actually backstopping federal rules. And so just as a couple of examples, we've got 7 states recently who adopted appliance efficiency standards, bringing that total to 14. We've also got 17 states who have either adopted the Clean Car Standards or in the process of adopting that, despite the actions that the federal government is taking to try to revoke California's waiver. And that's because they know that protecting their constituencies, their families from carbon pollution is something that they deserve to have the right to and that they have had 40 years of precedent that allows them to. So states continue to push back against the federal deregulatory agenda. In addition to that, you see states that are expanding carbon markets in the United States. We forget about that sometimes. So you've got Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New Jersey that are rejoining RGGI or joining RGGI for the first time. You've also got a bunch of states in the Northeast that are in the process of formulating a carbon market for transportation. That's huge. And then finally, states are really focused also on how they can include principles like equity, environmental justice, and just transition at the core of their policymaking, because it's important to them that they're bringing along all communities as we transition to a low-carbon economy. So what does this leadership look like when you look across some of the key sectors? So first, if we look at transportation, 80% of all zero-emission vehicles in the United States are sold in Alliance states. And new vehicle sales for zero-emission vehicles are actually 3 times the rate that you see elsewhere in the country. That market penetration is still too small. It's only 3% of the market. But it means that the policies that they're putting in place, like the financial incentives, building out EV charging infrastructure, having a zero-emission vehicle mandate, are critical to actually getting traction in a very difficult sector. When you look at the progress that we've made in the energy sector, so Alliance states since 2005 have seen a 5-fold increase in non-hydro renewable growth. By 2018, already almost half of all the power that was generated in Alliance states was coming from zero carbon sources. And when we look at efficiency, we see that 70% of new utility level energy efficiency investments is happening in Alliance states. And consumers from Alliance states are seeing twice the level of energy efficiency savings as in non-Alliance states. And so that means that we're not only reducing our emissions from the power sector and we're building out less infrastructure, we don't need that, right? But we're actually putting money in the pockets of consumers in these states. But leadership matters, right? So we're doing all of these things, but at the same time, we're still not tackling a big enough share of national emissions. And so what you see in this graph, so the green below, is the emissions trajectory for Alliance states. So by 2030, we expect that they'll reduce 20 to 32% of their emissions based on policies that are currently on the books, and that includes all of the rollbacks that we've seen at the federal level in the last 3 years. But if you look at non-Alliance states, at best, we're expecting an 8% decrease in emissions by 2030, and at worst, a 3% increase. And remember, that gray band is 60% of US emissions. So leadership matters, not only at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, and with US businesses. The climate crisis is just too big for us to tackle alone. Even our states, with all of the authorities that they have, with their share of the emissions that they control, we still need help and we need to work together. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to work with the business community. Just one quick story before we talk about our kind of 4 opportunities here. The first is, we've made a lot of progress on HFCs. So for example, if you look at 2 years ago, I think California was the only state that was regulating hydrofluorocarbons, which are thousands of times more potent than CO2 and found in refrigerants primarily. Today, we've got 15 states that are in the process of regulating HFCs. And the way that that happened was spurred by industry. So we had industry groups and companies that produce the alternatives, that manufacture the products that will use the alternatives, who saw that the Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol, and the Kigali Amendment created an opportunity for a global market for low GWP HFCs, right? But the US had federal rules that had been vacated. And so they approached the states and they said, look, this is an opportunity for American innovation. And by the way, you get to also reduce emissions. It's a win-win for everybody, right? So they educated our states as to what the opportunity would be and how they would work with them. They then offered technical assistance, so offered to review policies, to help them define the types of things that companies would support, to bring other partners to the table to support states. They also were vocal in the way that they support states, so not only behind closed doors, kind of commending governors who are taking action, but being vocal, standing on stage with alliance states, putting out op-eds and press releases to talk about the importance of taking action on HFCs. And as a result of that, we've been able to make tremendous progress. And then what we see on the Hill today is that those companies were then able to go to the Hill and say, look, we've got all of these states that are putting in place policies. What we really need is a national framework for how we can actually phase down HFCs and also be in compliance with what the opportunity is at the global level, right? So they've been working with the Hill in order to formulate policies, and we've now got bipartisan bills in both chambers of Congress that stand a real chance of actually getting through and being passed if we can get a handful of people to get out of the way. And part of that is building on the leadership of the states, but that's because industry approached them and offered this as a solution. So tremendous potential for us to do this together. HFCs are easy compared to some of the other sectors, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle them. So kind of the last note that I will leave you on is I think that there's kind of 4 opportunities that you can find from that story. One is to go and talk to the governor's offices, talk to their technical staff, and help just educate and advocate for climate actions. Our governors are already doing that, but there's lots of other governors in other states who really need to hear from you that you support that and it's an opportunity. The second is to partner with them, right? Offer technical assistance, show them how you can do it. But then also look at even mutual goals. So I'm just thinking about like our collective purchasing power for things like building materials or fleet transformation. We can do a lot more if we do it together. And then support what they're doing. I mean, one of the complaints that I've heard before from many of our states is that, and I'm looking at the NGO people here especially, a lot of times there's, people are in an uproar because they're not doing enough, but there's only so much political will, political chits, bandwidth to actually get stuff done. And so when a governor is actually doing something, come out and commend them for that action so that they can be even more ambitious the next time. And finally, defend states' rights. I think what we've seen in the last few years is that we really need states to have the ability to backstop federal rules as they're being rolled back to make sure that we're not starting from zero a year from now or maybe 5 years from now. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Alliance, we have our 2018 annual report, or 2019 annual report that came out in December. I am pleased to say that it is already out of date because we've had so many policies that have come out at the state level. And then there's also a fact sheet for each of the states that provides a little bit more in-depth information across all of them so you can access that at our website. So thank you again for the opportunity to chat with you.
Please welcome back to the stage Janet Pease, Senior Vice President of Policy and Business Strategy at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions.
So I think we probably all knew there was a lot of things going on in the state. So I personally really appreciate hearing from Julie and knowing a little bit more about what the Alliance is doing. It's so cool that it's not just coastal states. It's not just, Democrat. It's a bipartisan effort. That's very exciting. So I'd like to welcome you now to our next plenary conversation about accelerating the clean energy revolution through technology and investment. So in this next session, we're going to explore this idea of a clean energy revolution, and specifically from the idea of technology, or specifically from the issues of technology and investment. I think you probably remember from several of the conversations we've had today, but especially the one that Jim Saber put out there when he was talking about these new technologies. There's a lot of new technologies that are really getting a lot of attention. I mean, wind and solar, of course, but electric vehicles, more attention. Carbon capture, use, and storage. I came from a round table during the strategy exchange sessions. The cost of these technologies are coming down, and the interest is definitely increasing. But what about cement? It's kind of cool. We got low carbon cement, steel, and now we're going to hear a little bit about low carbon aluminum. I'm pretty excited. I'm an environmentalist, and I think these low carbon technologies and these low carbon solutions are super important. But as we have continued to hear throughout the last 2 days, it's not enough. We have to accelerate. We have to do more. We have to really scale up these technologies and their use and their deployment if we're actually going to get to the level that scientists say we need to do and reduce emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We just did a report, C2ES did a report this last year called Getting to Zero. And I think Bob alluded to this. I mean, most deep decarbonization scenarios say we got to completely decarbonize the electricity system. We have to push energy efficiency. We have to electrify as much of the economy as we can. And we've got to increase carbon sequestration. But to do all of this, to really accelerate our technology deployment, that requires investment. So, with me, we have 3 great speakers who looked at these issues from various perspectives. First, Ethan Zindler, who is head of Americas at BloombergNEF. I'm sure most of you have heard and read materials from Bloomberg. They're a provider of insight, data, news on energy, advanced transportation. I mean, the list goes on. And as you probably would expect, Ethan is well-informed and follows these issues closely. And then next, we have Kyung-Ah Park, who is the Managing Director and Head of Environmental Markets and Innovation in the Sustainable Finance Group at Goldman Sachs. In that capacity, she closely tracks market solutions, innovative financing, and she also leads the work on climate transition and policy. So I think where the money goes, Kyung-Ah will have a lot to say. And then at the end, last but not least, Vincent Christ, who's the president of ELYSIS. I'm probably not saying that right, but I'm giving it my best.
ELYSIS.
ELYSIS. How many in here have actually heard of ELYSIS? So it's a partnership between Alcoa, Rio Tinto, the government of Quebec, and the federal government of Canada, and they're developing zero carbon aluminum smelting. And I mean, Vincent's been looking at R&D and cool tech for a long time. So I think new technology and where that's going, we've got 3 great speakers. And so, hopefully this now turns on.
There you go.
So with that, we're going to explore this issue from 3 different dimensions, from research, from finance, and from deployment of a new cool technology. So I am just going to get the conversation started, and I want to just pose a generic question, because I'm very excited about these new technologies. Let me ask you what you think is the most exciting dimension right now in clean tech or clean tech finance. Ethan, why don't you give it a start? We'll just
I mean, of all the things, I mean, certainly I thought Julia did a great job of sort of articulating some of the commitments that we've seen, but to me the most exciting thing is that cost competitiveness. We are now at a point where clean energy technologies in many parts of the world and in many circumstances are the lowest cost option. So we no longer have to engage in this debate over, oh wow, I wish it would be cheap enough so that we could be zero carbon. Actually, often the least cost option is a zero carbon source of power generation. We're not there yet on electric vehicles, to be clear, but we at BloombergNEF think we're definitely pretty close. We'll probably be there within the next 4 or 5 years. So the amount of progress that's been achieved in terms of driving down costs and creating a market for these technologies that is no longer 100% subsidy driven, and let's be honest, it used to be, to my mind, is the most important achievement so far.
There definitely is a role for government in providing those subsidies to get things started, but it's very cool that we're moving past that. Kyung-Ah, what do you think is exciting these days?
Yeah, so definitely economics is at the foundation of this, but from my perspective, given I live and breathe in a global financial institution, it's really the step change in terms of how much capital is really flowing and wants to flow into these solution sets. So just to give Goldman Sachs as an example, in 2005, when we first formalized what we call an environmental policy framework, which is essentially a roadmap for how we will harness markets to help address climate change and other environmental issues, we had a $1 billion investment target to invest in clean energy. It felt very ambitious at that time. And I won't go through all the details of how we evolved this, but just to give you just a few quick numbers, 2012, we established a $40 billion target over 10 years. 2015, it became $150 billion. We're about 2/3 of the way there, but last year, as we looked at the markets and what our client needs are and where the market opportunities are headed, what we decided to do is actually expand that target even further to $750 billion over 10 years. And really include the breadth of climate transition solutions, certainly clean energy, sustainable transport, waste materials, ag and food, all the way through ecosystem services. And as Judy said, importantly, we also need to make sure it's a just transition. So inclusive growth is now part of that as well. So climate transition and inclusive growth together. And we are just one small example of what's happening in the market. Right? And there's so much investor demand to try to do more around ESG integration and sustainable investing. And there are many more financial tools that have now been unlocked to be able to channel that capital to these solution sets, whether it's very deep liquid public markets, and I'm sure Ethan will talk a bit more about this because he's a number guru. But there's been a whole advent of green bonds, which is use of process dedicated bond financing instruments. But that's now evolved into sustainability bonds, climate transition bonds, resiliency bonds. And again, I won't go into too much detail unless you ask me to later on, but another innovation is around sustainability KPI-linked bonds that effectively link the cost of capital to sustainability performance outcomes, so really generating cost of capital linkage to sustainability. So a huge amount of innovation going on. And then a lot of different types of capital, not only institutional, but strategic capital, companies who really want to invest in cutting edge technologies, because it's important for them to be able to bring these technologies into their value chain as they think about the decarbonization and the resilience and growth of their business. Incredible amount of excitement and step change going on in the markets right now.
Okay, I'm glad you're excited because it makes me very enthusiastic about this. Yeah. Vincent, what do you think is cool? I mean, zero carbon aluminum is pretty cool, but...
Before starting with zero carbon, I think it's interesting when you look at the change in living standard, the energy transition, transportation, infrastructure. When you look at all of this together, over the next 30 years, we're going to mine as much as we did in the global history. What that means that whatever you mine, you got to transform in several steps until it gets to a product. So there's a whole value chain that you have to look at. So what ELYSIS particularly is interested in or looks at is decarbonizing the aluminium process. What does that actually mean? It's very simple. The carbon actually used since its invention, 1886, producing aluminium using carbon. We eliminate the carbon completely from the process through new proprietary breakthrough materials. What that means actually is that when you produce aluminium with this breakthrough technology, you actually emit oxygen, right? So you have to see both of these angles. The other part of this angle is and I think that's what the industries really need is breakthrough technology, but not just to address the environmental aspect, but also the economics. So with this process, you produce 15% more, so it's more productive. It actually costs less to produce. It immunizes companies against any carbon pricing scheme. And the product itself is the same aluminium, a commercial product, but greener, so it attracts a higher premium. So that kind of innovation, I think, is going to be a breakthrough, because when you think about what I just said about how much we're going to mine in the future, we got to have these processes that actually eliminate the carbon in its entirety. One thing about how actually to set up a partnership is also part of the innovation, I think, in this particular case. It's the coming together of two competitors that represent about 10% of the global industry in aluminium, coming together two governments, the federal and the provincial government of Canada, interested in decarbonizing the industry, because it's a significant industry in Canada. That industry alone produces about 3.5 million tons of aluminium in Canada, which is equivalent to about 7 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. And when you look at what does it actually mean implementing the technology in this environment, it will mean like removing 1.8 million cars from the streets in Canada. That's the CO2 emission part. And the oxygen part is like planting trees the size of the Lake Erie, so significant amount. So that partnership was also supported by, interestingly, Apple, the consumer product company, and their interest is to decarbonize the supply chain, so they're actually investing in that kind of breakthrough technology.
So I was interested, so Jim Saber this morning said, we've been talking about hydrogen, it's always just around the corner, and that kind of innovation, that kind of money, the whole revolution that's going on with energy, why now, what's different, why is that going on, do you guys think?
Sorry, which revolution in energy?
So energy. So all of these different
multiple
changes. I know that all of these changes. What's spurring that? I mean, so the U.S. we've really pulled back on policy. So what's the interest from the investment side? Why are we seeing these cool technologies really getting a lot of air attention these days?
Well, I think Kyung-Ah can speak a little bit about what the motivation of the investors are, but I'll talk a little bit about the industry and saying that, I think it's a nice confluence in the sense that there is growing investor pressure to try to address climate things. And thankfully, we've kind of arrived at a moment where actually a lot of these technologies are becoming truly viable. Not hydrogen yet, just to be clear, not even close yet, but on some of the nearer term technologies, you can invest and make real money. And I think it's worth mentioning, and I think Julia delivered a lot of great news, but I put a few other pieces of good news on top of that, which is we've counted $3 trillion of total investment so far into clean energy assets. Those are zero carbon power generating assets. It's not a weak definition. I'm not including gas and other things, just renewables. And last year alone, the U.S. attracted $55 billion in investment basically for wind and solar projects, which was a record year for investment. And that came in the third year of the Trump administration. And here in the fourth year of the Trump administration, our view is we will see the most ever wind and solar added with about 25 gigawatts of new capacity built in this country. We're going to probably come up on about 10 million electric vehicles sold around the world. So there's an enormous amount of progress that's taken place that's been market driven. I do think there's an ESG angle and a push from investors to want to deal with these things. But frankly, I don't think companies would be comfortable, and BlackRock's and Goldman's and others wouldn't be comfortable making those kinds of commitments if they didn't think they could earn a return on doing those types of things. That $750 billion number makes a lot of sense in the context of the $3 trillion that I've seen invested over the last 15 years in this sector. That's a number that's now reasonable if we look out over the next decade.
That's all 100% commercial, by the way. It's not concessional philanthropy, none of that.
Right.
And I think this is, the key, which is the business case, broadly defined, I think has become incredibly compelling, right? So if you think about the risk side of the equation, and oftentimes prudential regulators and people, when they talk about climate change, talk about it in multiple different buckets, but particularly physical risk is one dimension. And I think people are now feeling more tangibly how climate change is becoming more visible in their home places, whether it's wildfires, whether it's droughts, whether it's more kind of volatile weather patterns, et cetera. And the markets are now seeing tangible economic losses as a result of this, right? Whether it's insurance issues, whether it's companies that are being more challenged from a credit perspective. And so that risk component from a physical perspective is certainly manifesting itself. Transition is the point that Vincent was talking about, where we all know as climate change becomes more urgent, there is going to be growing constraints around carbon, whether it's carbon pricing, whether it's through mandates, whether it's net zero goals. And if you're a long-term investor or a company that's planning for the long term, it's very clear the direction of travel. So you want to start building your business to become more resilient against policy, but also the dramatic technology innovation that's happening. I mean, it's quite incredible to see research forecasts coming out every year that continue to underestimate how quickly innovation is happening and how cheaper technology is getting, right? And so that's a risk dimension. You know, on the return dimension of things, when you think about just purely take a look at what's happened to the energy sector, the public market, energy, about a decade or so ago, was about 15% of the S&P 500. It's less than 5% today. And when you look at clean energy, renewable energy, it is now accounting for the vast majority of the market growth. I mean, I saw some very compelling numbers around 1,200 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2024 will get installed. That's a very big market opportunity in a market which is quite anemic in terms of growth, right? And so there's real money to be deployed there. On top of when you think about it, I mean, it's quite fascinating to have the conversations with some of the companies who are outside of the energy sector who will also say, this is important for me in terms of attracting the best talent in a labor-constrained environment and retaining that talent. And frankly, for technology companies, also having employees not be your activists, right? And so the broad business case around that has become much more compelling.
You know, it's funny you mentioned, I looked at battery numbers, for example, and they get better, and they're getting cheaper every single year. I mean, I have a Volt, and you know, I can go like 60 miles on a nice warm day, but the Bolt is like 250 miles on a charge. It's pretty cool. Vincent,
what is interesting from a Canadian perspective, the aluminium industry there operates under hydropower, right? So clean energy. Nevertheless, it already uses today the large producers as a battery. And I think that's something that in the future we will see more and more when you think about solar and hydropower, solar and wind power, that you need large consumers that can, you know, run their consumption up and down to actually help the peak hours of, you know, morning, evening, lunch. That is something that is interesting. And actually the aluminum industry specifically allows for some load shedding today already, but a little bit only. And the fact that this technology I just spoke about a few minutes ago has actually a much broader window of flexibility will be also very attractive for renewable energy. So this combination, because battery is going to be an issue, not for cars, I mean, we're getting there, but for large energy storage, that's going to be a challenge.
So I'm just going to come back. So Kyung-Ah, you mentioned the word policy. So you know where policy wonks at C2ES. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that all of this happens just magically. So Vincent, why Quebec and not the U.S.?
I think it goes back to the question of talent. We actually have an organization where we have a group that is dedicated to materials that sits in Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. The design of the technology that requires a very specific expertise, that comes out of France. And the company is located in Montreal, headquartered in Montreal. And the next scale-up phases are going to happen in Canada. And why is that Canada? Because Canada has abundant hydropower energy, so it makes a lot of sense to convert this industry to this carbon-free process. It also has an established industry, so you need to tap into talent that exists. And ultimately, it's, you can say the way to bring this together is not just a partnership in terms of financing, but also how you bring the talent, the US talent, the French talent, the Canadian talent around the table to actually make it happen. Because it's the biggest innovation in the industry since inception, more than 130 years ago. So that is why, it's hard, but when you get the right people, the right support, and the right funding, and the right focus, In 2024, we expect to commercialize the
Do
technology.
you think that having policy that's stable and predictable actually helps too? So you can kind of plan. I mean, Quebec's had a carbon price. They've had this agenda for at least a decade.
Absolutely. The Canada has several funds that support clean tech, larger ones, smaller ones, tailored for small and medium enterprise, tailored for bigger ones. And that is actually a real help. I have to admit, it takes time until you find the doors. But once you find the doors, you know, when you have I guess something quite unique and something promising, then you know you get the support.
So on the negative side, so there's all this enthusiasm, and everybody in this room, we've been hearing about all this upside. What could derail this transition, this enthusiasm we're seeing for clean tech?
Well, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, excuse me, we at BloombergNEF probably have some of the most optimistic forecasts out there for how fast we think the power sector will continue to decarbonize, how quickly we think electric vehicles will be adopted over the next 20 years. We think that about half the US sales by 2040 will be EVs. We think about 40 or 50% of all power will be renewable by 2050. These are, a long way from where we are right now, but the reality is they don't get us anywhere close to addressing the threat of climate change. And so, you can look at all the progress that's been achieved in the U.S. over the last 10 years, in particular in the power sector, where our emissions have come down really dramatically. Last year, the U.S. power sector emissions dropped by 7.5% in 1 year. There were some unusual factors, of course, but we've continued to take our coal plants offline. We got about half as much coal online as we did 10 years ago. Gas has been, surging, and renewables have gone from about 10 to 18% of our generation in just a decade. It's been a remarkable transformation, and so you can feel very good about those things. But the reality of it is that, we're going to keep decarbonizing the power sector. There's a certain momentum there. Frankly, there's another 30 gigawatts of coal that's due to come offline in the next 5 years, and that the Trump administration can do anything it wants. That's going to happen. But the question is, how do you really deeply decarbonize to the point that we need to? And I think it's fantastic, all the stuff that the states are doing, and it's wonderful. But if you really look out further, like we're going to need we're going to need all 50 states on board. We're going to actually do something about this. And that requires federal leadership, which we clearly don't have right now.
The other thing I would just add to this, in addition to kind of the urgency and how we need to have policy, technology, and capital all work in concert, one of the things that I do sometimes get a bit concerned about is this question around how do we make sure that this climate transition, which we need to do, and climate change does actually impact the most vulnerable people, but yet at the same time, as we move the economy into the right place, it does have distributional consequences, and those who are underserved does get disproportionately impacted, particularly in the middle of the country and in developing markets. And so how do you make this something that is more inclusive, I think is incredibly important to get right. Because if you don't get it right, you are going to have political consequences, and moving policy and having that long-term consistency is going to be incredibly challenging. And then on top of that, you've seen these cases where this is inherently a global issue, right? Climate doesn't know any boundaries, and technologies and markets are inherently global, yet it can result in nationalism and protectionism, which could actually deter the market and the development and the sharing of these technologies, right? And so those are some of the things that we just need to be conscious as we move the climate agenda forward and move these conversations and policy and investments forward.
I think it's interesting to see what's happening in the aluminium industry. Again, the metal all looks the same, right? It's a commodity, but there is a difference, significant difference in the carbon footprint depending where and how you produce it. And there has been a global initiative on the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and that is actually, it's a qualification linked to the carbon footprint of the metal. So what I think we need is, with the technology that we have today, with whether it's blockchain or what have you, is that you're actually able to trace whatever you buy in the end, whatever a consumer touches. He knows like the calories on a chip pack, he knows the footprint of carbon of that chip pack. And that goes back to the agriculture chain, way through the whole consumption line. The day we have that transparency, I think you can address it probably in a more systemic way than yes, energy is a big portion, but I mentioned the raw materials, because if you don't do anything about the raw materials, yeah, you solve the energy problem, but you need all the copper, the aluminum, the steel, the cement to actually do it, right? So it's a broad agenda.
The bauxite is pretty energy intensive. So I think that is a really important point about educating consumers. I mean, it's not just about one policy, right? So there's not one policy. You also have to involve consumers. You need to involve other stakeholders. I mean, I think what's going on with the Canadian rail system in Canada right now being stopped. You can't move materials. I think that's a pretty illustrative example of making sure that you've got your stakeholders involved. Why do you think that we have all these partnerships? You know, you keep hearing about these different groups. I mean, so you've got, you know, Rio Tinto and Alcoa, and you've got some buyers out there that want your product. But there are a lot of other ones. I mean, there's Solidia. We heard about Carbon Cure from the cement side. Net Power is a carbon capture and storage, and it's a partnership. Why partnerships? Why not just take all the economic rent?
I can explain that easily, particularly when it's linked to breakthrough. Because what it means actually that you have a hugely ambitious goal. So that means you have a high-risk undertaking. So you need to pull together companies that have complementary skills. You need support from the government in terms of funding to de-risk the whole venture, because simply the size of the bet is huge. So you need partners, and the better you build your partnership, the most likely you're going to be successful, right? So I think partnership is one of the keys.
I think offsetting the risk is the main reason. I mean, with CCS in the U.S., we couldn't see, companies weren't willing to plunge $1 billion or $2 billion into it without, they wanted partnership with the federal government, and then they want potentially partnership with others. It's just too much money to try on a new technology. You know, this is not venture capital when you're talking $1 billion plus on a new tech.
I think that's an important point. These are expensive, long-lived investments. I think that's really important.
But I think the partnerships are happening across the spectrum, right? On the one hand, for capital-intensive technologies that you have to scale and commercialize, for sure, sharing that financial risk is important, and also having the visibility of the market pull is going to be also important, right? Which is essentially what you're doing with Apple in many ways. And as an example, you know, we co-led $1 billion investment into an electric battery company in Sweden that benefited from Volkswagen and a number of other companies coming in both as an investor as well as providing the market visibility, right? And so these are very large gigafactories, 2 of them that are getting built, and so that's an example of de-risking. But you're also seeing it in the very early venture stages, and I think one, it's driven by the fact that when you think about where we are in the markets right now, I'm sure many of you have heard about the 4th Industrial Revolution, where there's massive disruption going on from technology change, not just climate and sustainability, but technology change, right? Mm-hmm. Computing power has become so cheap. Everybody has a device, a connected device, right? And big data, AI, digital technology is becoming ubiquitous, right? And so there's massive disruption going on everywhere. And so for many companies, it's also about making sure that they get line of sight into technologies that they may otherwise not have, right? And have an ecosystem to be able to do that enables venture capital investors to be also benefit from the strategic insights as well. So you're seeing those types of partnerships happening as well. And trying to solve for technologies that don't exist, that they know they have to bring through the value chain in order for them to achieve their de-risking or sustainability goals, I think is another component of it. But if I may, just one other point that I make, because you brought up the trains and pipelines, is talking about risk, right? One of the other trends that we've actually seen over the years, which is quite remarkable, is non-governmental organizations, some of them that actually have a very specific agenda, in some cases actually even activist, partnering with companies and mainstream investors to put pressure on companies to change. So a good example of this is Climate Action 100, which actually now is targeting 161 companies, not just 100 companies. And it includes like the who's of asset owners and asset managers who are now working together in concert to try to actually influence change quicker at companies to try to achieve climate goals. And I think that's actually been quite a remarkable change over the last few years in terms of those types of partnerships coming together.
I actually went into a company not too long ago to give them the 101 on what's going on with carbon tax on the Hill. And they said, I don't really care about any of that. Because what my CEO is really interested in is all that shareholder pressure that I'm hearing about.
Yeah.
That's what they wanted to talk about. And where is that coming from? Like Climate 100, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I want to leave enough time for just a couple questions from the audience. So would you mind if I just cut it off right here and we'll see if we can take a few from the audience. And I can't see a soul out there.
Yeah.
Maybe I move over here. If you want to put your arm up, hey, I can see better. Does anybody have a question for these guys while we're up here? We have a question right down here in the front. If we can get a microphone real quick. There's one on its way. Jessica is hustling it over to you.
Where are you?
Right there, right there.
Hi, Agnes Nada from Exelon. So you guys mentioned when you start looking at some of the climate impacts, you mentioned equity and how some of the populations and people that are going to be affected are disproportionately going to be the most vulnerable communities. So when you start looking at, there's been a lot of discussion in the conference around trying to motivate companies through investor pressure and trying to look at decarbonization, look at climate impacts. But how do you sort of start to address some of that concept of equity, and how do you motivate companies to include that in their considerations as well?
Yeah, you know, it's a really tough question, right? And there's no one silver bullet to this. And I've seen many examples of how both investors, companies, and frankly, public policy has to tackle this, right? In Europe, as they legislate towards a net zero carbon goal, they are putting together a just transition fund to be able to invest in communities that are going to be disproportionately marginalized, right? There are companies in the context of both climate, but again, this whole kind of technology disintermediation that's happening. And in fact, I've seen some statistics as high as 400 million people are going to be out of their existing jobs by 2030 just purely by automation. And these are the most repetitive jobs. So how do you actually work in concert with the public policy and the public sector with companies to retool these people and actually train, working with education institutions to train for future jobs and skills that are actually going to be needed? Because the reality is we're actually in a tight labor market, right? So the question is, how do you actually retool many of them and provide the right incentives for the right types of jobs as well? And frankly, I think we just have to be realistic that certain sectors it won't be around. And so how do you actually think through diversification of the economy? I mean, we talk about bringing coal jobs back. No matter what policy you put in place, coal jobs in the US are not really going to come back. And I hate to say that, but the reality is economics, technology, and the way investors and companies are readjusting their supply chains and investments, coal is not going to come back. So what do you do for those communities? You have to help diversify and think through other ways of actually providing livelihoods. So there's no silver bullet, but I think there's lots of different ways to work in concert, understand the realities, and thinking longer term about how to actually help those communities, in addition to role of philanthropy as well. That's sort of where philanthropy comes in as well.
I just add on to that. First, completely agree on coal. I mean, the horse has left the gate for the most part, and it is very sad for many people who are living in some of those communities, and coal's not coming back. To me, the question is on sort of next technologies. As we think, saying this sitting here in Detroit is, what about the next wave of the electrification of the automobile sector, and what are the implications for the supply chain around vehicles? You need a lot less parts to make an EV than you do to make an internal combustion engine car, and what are going to be the worker implications of that? And this is something that certainly I hope that the automakers are across thinking about how they retool essentially to achieve some of those goals, because our view is electric vehicles are ultimately inevitable. We're not there yet, but we will be soon. And when that happens, it is going to be very disruptive for the existing value chain for vehicles.
I think once more people start driving electric vehicles and they find out how fun they are. But anyway, there's a question back here.
Junko Suba from, oh, that's quite loud. Junko Suba from Steinberg Asset Management. Thank you for the insightful comments. It was very nice to hear the trends around the shift in technology and capital. And earlier, I was a panel discussion around the Paris Climate Agreement. And given election year, there's two pathways. Either we get back in or we'll stay out for another 4 years. So I'm just curious, whether we stay in or out, how does that affect these trends that you mentioned in terms of the technology and capital flows?
I'll comment on that for 1 second. I mean, most of my clients are people who are investing in, the energy sector, or trying to not lose money on the energy sector, but have a financial stake in it. And I honestly can't say that I've heard of a single decision, a go, no-go decision about an investment that's been driven by the Paris Climate Accord, frankly, positive or negative, since when we signed on or since when Trump announced that he wanted to pull out. The much more important things for decision for investors are policies that are closer to the ground. And whether that's, for instance, CAFE standards, and whether or not we really are going to actually have a long-term policy to decarbonize the transportation sector in some fundamental way. The production tax credit, renewable portfolio standards at the state level, that's what drives decisions day to day for investors much, much more than Paris. So I don't mean to blow off Paris. I think it sends an incredibly important signal to the rest of the world about the U.S.'s commitment or lack thereof on climate, and I think that's really critical. But the reality is, even if the U.S. was fully on board with Paris, we would need domestic policies to make sure we actually achieve the goals. The agreement is only as good as the follow-through. And frankly, a lot of countries that have signed on to Paris haven't followed through, haven't put in place policies to actually achieve those goals. So, Paris is wonderful, and it's a great symbolic thing that sits out there, but it's not driving market activity.
Just to give you a specific example, to underscore Ethan's point, I remember in 2015 when the Paris Agreement came together towards the end of the year, right? And shortly thereafter, the U.S. government actually passed the extension of the tax credit, for I think a 5-year extension, right? And when the Paris Agreement actually was announced, the public solar companies' stock prices didn't go meaningfully up, but when the tax credit extension was actually done, it went meaningfully up, right? So it just gives you a market signaling of the confidence and the importance of domestic policy. But I do think having the U.S. at the table, it does have a huge symbolic effect, and it's actually quite disconcerting that we don't have U.S. leadership. And it's not just around the Paris Agreement. There's a lot going on. There's something called the NGFS, which brings together central banks and regulators around how to think about climate risk issues and to share best practices. There are probably 40 plus different countries that are engaging on this. We don't have US at the federal level participating. New York State, I think, has just joined, but we need to be engaged in these conversations.
Vincent, I know that you're not thinking about U.S. policy, but Canada is a signatory.
I'm not going to speak about U.S. policy for sure.
Canada is a signatory to Paris. Does that matter to you guys?
What I think is interesting is that when you look at the funding that we received, right, you can also say, well, what if the government changes and so forth? Well, you enter into serious contracts, right? So you would expect that survives whatever government comes along. There are some which are more favorable than others, for sure. I think we had a very good response from the government in terms of encouraging investment in clean tech. Strategic Investment Fund that was put in place by the Canadian federal government for $1.5 million. Dedicated to investment in clean tech and job creation, because Canada seems to see this as an opportunity, actually.
I like to think of Paris as kind of a signpost that we're committed for those long-term signals, for those big investments that require a long-term commitment. And I think contracts are part of it, but I personally like the signal that it sends. We are out of time. I want to ask you to join with me and thank our speakers. I think we've had a pretty in-depth conversation of technology, finance, and project development. So thank you guys. Thanks, guys. And now I want to invite up to the stage Carla Frisch. She's the principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute working on America's Pledge. And if you haven't noticed, America's Pledge is a headline sponsor for the Climate Leadership Conference. We're very happy to have them. America's Pledge brings together private and public sector leaders to ensure that the United States remains a leader in reducing emissions so that we can deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement that we were just talking about. And I'm going to have her now tell you a little bit more about it. Carla, come on up.
Thank you. And what a pleasure to hear the breadth and depth of activity in the US and Canada. Thank you, Canada. After hearing this and attending several sessions, you start to get a feel for the landscape of climate action in the US. And that question, what is that landscape? What's really going on? Is one of the founding questions of America's Pledge. America's Pledge is a Bloomberg Philanthropies initiative, and my organization, Rocky Mountain Institute, along with our partners, University of Maryland and World Resources Institute, have been working to answer those questions. So right now in the US, with coalitions like the US Climate Alliance, we are still in, there are more than 3,800 entities committed to climate action. And Julie gave you some of the stats on the states and what their impact adds up to. But if you look across states and cities and businesses, those coalitions in the US represent almost 70% of US GDP, 65% of US population, and more than half of US emissions. So to put that in perspective, 70% of US GDP is larger than the economy of China. And our international colleagues have noticed this movement of subnational action in the US. And as someone asking the question in the last panel pointed out, 2020 is a key year for international climate action. And every country around the world is thinking about how are we going to ratchet our ambition and what number are we going to put forward under the Paris Agreement about what we can achieve. And they are looking to the US to figure out what's really going on in the US and what's possible for US ambition. So we've released an analysis called Accelerating America's Pledge that dives into those questions. And what we've found is that if we take the cutting edge leaders in cities and states and businesses in the US now and accelerate what they're doing, we could achieve a 37% reduction in US emissions in 2030 from a 2005 baseline. That's really significant. Now, what does it mean on a practical level? You can think of it in 3 steps. 1, we continue to accelerate the trend toward 100% clean or 100% zero emissions electricity. A lot of companies here are doing that. A lot of cities are doing that. Just last week, Charlotte, North Carolina made a big announcement about a 35 gigawatt solar. Huge. So once we have that clean electricity, then step 2 is using it, and using it now in our buildings, our transportation, and our industry. So on the buildings front, by 2030, that means that all new buildings in the United States need to be highly efficient and all electric. So everything in those buildings, all the appliances are powered by electricity. On the transportation front, we heard some of this in the transportation panel this afternoon, but that we need to accelerate quickly toward an electric vehicle fleet, light duty and heavy duty in the US. So we're about 2% new car sales in the US are electric right now. By 2030, we need to be north of 70%. So accelerating those investments now. And then third, of course, is enhancing ecosystems. We heard this theme about natural solutions in several panels yesterday and today. So optimizing the carbon storage potential of our forests, our farms, and our coastal wetlands. They're essential to the ecosystems of the US and how much carbon we can sequester. So if on top of that, the federal government were to step back in and Congress and the executive branch were to build on this wave of bottom-up momentum in the US, we can reduce US emissions to net zero by 2050. There is a clear path to that goal. It's a steep path, but a very clear path. And I'll say, on behalf of America's Pledge, our challenge to you all is to continue that momentum and have so much U.S. climate activity underway that you make it impossible for us to do our jobs of tracking that activity. So please make it impossible for us to do our jobs. And with that, I'll say thank you to the Climate Registry, thank you to C2ES, and thank you to all of you.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, it's a hard job to track all these. I think it's a nice goal to make it even more difficult. So now I want to invite you to join us upstairs at a reception on the 4th floor area. And again, this reception is ahead of our Climate Leadership Awards dinner, which starts at 7 o'clock tonight. I hope to see you all there. I hope to see you all on the 4th, and thank you. I hope you've had a good day.